Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
We watched in horror a week ago as Hurricane Milton slammed into Florida, just days after Hurricane Helene had devastated the southeast United States. Neither storm was, strictly speaking, unprecedented, but the power of both of them within 10 days of one another shocked meteorologists and turned the cable news ecosystem volume up to 11.
Just an incredible hurricane. It has dropped 50 millibars in 10 hours. I apologize. This is just horrific.
And the water now is really starting to pour over. If you look at the graph, whoa. Okay, that wasn't good. We'll probably go inside shortly, but you can see the amount of water here on the ground. This is water from the Manatee River.
Hundreds of lives have been lost, thousands of homes, billions of dollars in damages, and proof to many that the climate era is powering more storms of greater intensity. Proof to others, however, that it's a hoax, and meteorologists are not to be trusted, and the government controls the weather, and you get the idea. But here in Canada, our hurricane experts were watching these storms closely. Because in Atlantic Canada, it's hurricane season 2. And if we've entered a new era of superstorms, we need to be ready for them. So do the same factors that supercharged Milton apply in the waters off of our coast? Has Canada seen its own rise in the frequency and power of hurricanes in recent decades? What do you need to know to distinguish between hyperbole, conspiracy, and calm, rational science? And are we ready for what's coming for us? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Chris Fogarty is a meteorologist and the program manager at the Canadian Hurricane Center. Hey, Chris.
Good morning.
Thank you for finding some time for us today.
Yeah, no problem.
I want to start because everybody's been talking about hurricanes in the United States. As somebody who studies these storms, watching Helene and Milton one after the other over the past few weeks, what went through your head?
Yeah, we've had a few questions about that. You know, when's the last time two of these big storms hit the same general area back to back? And we started to look back into our record books, and it's not totally unheard of. There have been some cases in the past, but, you know, it's kind of like a once every 30 years sort of thing where one area will get like a double whammy like that. Florida is certainly the most probable part of the country to get frequently hit by hurricanes, so it's not a complete surprise there, but boy, oh boy, talk about getting kicked while you're down, eh?
No kidding, and I feel like we're going to use a lot of that terminology today, the 1 in 30 years, once in a century, once in 1,000 years type stuff. I've heard a lot of that over the past few weeks.
Yes, and it's kind of hard to define, too, these frequency statistics. Like, if it depends on how you define it, right? If you're talking about a single city getting hit back to back versus, you know, a province or a state.
Right.
You know, if you define the area larger geographically, then the frequency of, you know, one after another is, you know, much lower. So, yeah, it's all about math and statistics, you know, how you do define it. And sometimes if you define it a certain way, it can sound a little more dramatic or alarming.
Well, we wanted to talk to you today about the potential or possibility of Canada seeing these kinds of storms in the future. And before we get into that, maybe you can just explain to us what your job is at the Canadian Hurricane Center. Like, what exactly do you do?
I lead a team of forecasters so that when a hurricane is heading toward eastern Canada or even Ontario and Quebec sometimes feels the effects, I get my group of forecasters, on standby And I say, well, we might end up needing to staff the hurricane forecast desk for this event. And there'll be actions in sort of a 24/7 mode. And the Canadian Hurricane Center was established back in the late 80s after a couple hurricanes, in particular Gloria in 1985, affected Eastern Canada. And we didn't have much expertise in Canada of hurricane prediction. So that's when the Canadian Hurricane Center was established back then, to have a group of forecasters like myself and others to, focus on these particular storms and explain to Canadians what it means when one of these storms heads our way.
And before we get into the potential in Canada, a lot of the focus around the U.S. storms was on Hurricane Milton in particular. And people were so worried about, how quickly it strengthened. Can you just tell us what, if anything, you found unique about that storm and what you took away from watching it?
Yeah, when I saw Milton develop and rapidly intensify as well, it immediately reminded me of Hurricane Otis almost a year ago to the date. It hit Acapulco. You might have heard of that in the news. It was a huge storm. It went from tropical storm to Category 5 in a matter of a day and a half. And similar with Milton, October tends to be a time when you can get these very rapid intensifying storms because the water is kind of at its warmest down in the tropics and the Gulf of Mexico and around Mexico in general is the hottest waters of the season. So that's when you can get these really rapid intensifying storms.
Can you explain a little bit about the discourse we've been hearing about climate change powering this storm in particular? What's the theory behind that? And, how well can we actually determine whether or not climate change impacts an individual storm like Milton?
Yes, it's tricky to attribute a particular event to climate change or, human-caused changes in the atmosphere. On a larger scale, if we look at a collection of storms, or if we start looking at all the numbers and add up the rainfalls and things like that, we can kind of make some inferences. But we do understand in the science that hurricanes will have the potential to track a little more slowly. Also, warmer atmosphere means more moisture potential, more rainfall potential. So the flooding risk is increasing. But, if we go back to 1954, Hurricane Hazel, Toronto, huge flooding event, that was before all this concern about climate change. So these storms certainly have occurred in impactful ways in the past, even the 1800s. But, the frequency or the magnitude of their impact is more dramatic, more population, more development along the coastlines. So there's many different factors there than just climate change. We're building in prone areas too, which is a big factor.
What do all those factors mean for Canada? And specifically, I guess, if you could explain the areas of Canada, probably predominantly the Atlantic, that are vulnerable to these storms.
One of the big things we're concerned with is general sea level rise. So that's occurring in many parts of the world, certainly in Eastern Canada, even outside of any climate change, human changing the atmosphere. Even without that, the Earth is in this sort of isostatic rebound, it's called, since the last glacial max, so the last ice age. So the Earth is changing just in that alone. So the relative water levels are coming up. So as we build infrastructure along the water front, we can have storms that maybe 50 years ago did not have a big impact, but now they may have more of an impact because the water level has generally risen, and then you get a storm on top of that. So that's one of the big things we're, trying to educate people and developers on, make sure you build in these projections, right? We can't just go by what we're seeing nowadays.
A lot of the focus around Helene and Milton was about how much a much warmer Gulf and much warmer ocean impacted the strength of these storms. Is that something that is a factor off the coast of Atlantic Canada?
It certainly is. And as the water temperatures are increasing in general by, a handful of degrees over a decade, that will have a bearing in the intensity that a hurricane will strike us. For example, Nova Scotia, we kind of stick out into the Atlantic a bit here. And the real warm waters of the Gulf Stream aren't too far offshore. So the hurricanes can kind of make it up close to Nova Scotia completely intact. And then they move over the cooler waters near our coast. But even those cooler waters are warming, so the intensity of the hurricane may be decreasing as it approaches Nova Scotia. It's the rate at which it weakens is less in a warming ocean, warmer atmosphere scenario. So we could have an increased risk of getting a direct, full-on hurricane impact here in Nova Scotia, just as an example.
Compared to Florida and the southeast United States, how often do we see these kind of storms in Canada?
We have about 170 years of record for hurricanes in our part of the world, but they've been around for hundreds of years, right? But we only have about 170 years of data, and I look back for impactful storms in Canada, and basically it comes down to about once every 15 years there is a big storm. So in 2003 we had Hurricane Juan. In 2010, we had Igor in Newfoundland. That was very impactful, huge flooding. And then 2022, we had Fiona in Atlantic Canada. So right there alone, you're looking at about a decade in between big events. And that's kind of the rate at which we expect things, at least, a snapshot of today.
Are we expecting that to increase in the way it's doing in the States?
That's quite possible, with Hurricane Juan in 2003, and then only 8 years after that, and then Fiona 12 years after that. So really, it's kind of like once a decade, we get a really big event. But the atmosphere is strange. It can work in weird ways. There could be a really big storm next year, only 3 years after Fiona. The atmosphere won't obey that strict, 10 to 15 year frequency. You might get, just like Florida got Helene and Milton back to back, within a couple of weeks. Sometimes storms like that would be, several years apart. There was a period in Florida from 2005 to 2017, 12 years where they didn't have any major hurricanes category 3. But since 2017, they've been almost back to back. So the atmosphere does work in strange ways.
You are speaking so calmly and rationally about this when for the past 3 weeks, I feel like almost everything I've heard about hurricanes has either been terrified or dismissive. How do you feel about the discourse around these storms recently?
Yeah, when we can kind of get caught up, I guess, and, as they're happening, it's, very dramatic, and things can feel like on a trend towards chaos because so much has happened in a short period of time. We had a very quiet period through the middle of the hurricane season when we normally would expect a lot. And then the atmosphere and the ocean system will kind of kick into action to balance out. They always try to reach a state of equilibrium. So if you go for a long period without any storm activity, that's kind of a harbinger of, okay, something's going to give. The atmosphere is going to produce a storm to balance itself out. Otherwise, the Earth would continue to warm, at the equator excessively, right? If there was no weather systems to balance out the temperatures.
As a meteorologist, have you been following any of the threats, the disinformation, the claims that people in the United States are controlling the weather and sending hurricanes at politically expedient targets? I mean, meteorologists in the States are getting death threats. Have you seen this?
I've heard some of this stuff in the news and from colleagues, stories. We, as scientists, we try to remain very objective and stick to our scientific principles. And, keep our heads down and keep doing our work. We try not to let this other noise, sometimes we'll refer to it as, even in the social media realm, as we're producing our forecasts as government agencies, we're very disciplined and orderly, and we try to be very pragmatic as well, without hyperbole, very to the point. But meanwhile, we are seeing a lot of this other noise and dramatic forecasts that are filled with maybe excessive hyperbole. So it's a challenge for us. We're doing the forecasting, the science, the meteorology, but then there's the non-meteorological factors, the hype, and all this other stuff that goes on that we try to ignore, but we do, we know it's out there.
How does that make you feel? Because I feel like and I ask this to a lot of scientists and experts we have on this program, like there should be nothing more objective and factual and accepted than like weather forecasts from professional meteorologists, right? Like that should be the opposite of political, and yet now it is.
Yes, and the best thing we can do as government weather agencies is to stay the course, stay very focused on what we do, and keep providing people that consistent message. Over time, they'll see that, well, when we look at the forecasts coming from the Federal Weather Agency, that they deliver it in this very consistent style. And if they start to, use very concerning language, or predicting something very impactful, then people will heed that. Mm-hmm. And they need to as well filter out some of this other distractions or, hyperbole that sometimes comes with this job. It's tricky though, right? It's tricky to sort of filter that other stuff out.
Let's leave that stuff to the side for now. We've talked about what the storms might look like in the future. You mentioned earlier that stuff like development and where we build stuff needs to be taken into account, or how we build it.
Yes, and we will sometimes work with, we do have partnerships with provinces and municipalities and cities, and we'll work together on providing them some guidelines as to trends, or, you want to build this dock or that pier to this, standard, right? To project into the future what, impacts might be there. Another thing, too, with the sea level rise is that everything in the Bay of Fundy here in Nova Scotia is amplified at the head of that bay. So if you get a 10 centimeter rise in sea level overall, the magnitude of that rise is magnified up in around the Amherst area. So there's a lot of concern there. If we get a big storm coming in on a high tide, when the moon and the sun are all lined up, there could be the potential for a big, Nova Scotia become almost an island at some point. And that kind of happened about 150 years ago. So we're overdue for a big type of storm like that.
Are you finding that governments and developers are eager to heed this advice and work with it? And I ask that because in the United States, after that storm, we've already seen Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott say, we're not making any changes to the development code. We don't want to discourage building.
Yeah, that's a big thing. And I think it'll always occur. We still see the developments, particularly in the States, too. A lot of properties built right on the water. It's 99% of the time, it's beautiful, calm, tropical oceans, but you get these storms that's, that 1% of the time, and it could mess everything up. But we're seeing, action at different levels in government. Like there's a lot of talk right now and planning, and I think they're starting very soon to shore up some of the berms and the dikes up around the head of the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick there, because there's concern that there could be a big flood. It would come across the main rail and highway connection there to the rest of Canada. So that's a big concern. And you've probably been hearing a little bit about that in the news. There's some politics part of that, which levels of government are going to fund it.
Right.
But there is action. I think in the news cycle today, there's something about breaking ground on building up these levees there.
For anybody listening to this who lives in Atlantic Canada or even in Eastern Canada and areas that sometimes get hit by these big ones, what are the easy things that they could do right now to ensure they're ready for whenever the next big storm comes through?
I try to get people to think on sort of longer time frame and then the shorter time frame. The shorter time frame stuff, I think most people are quite versed in now. okay, the power goes out for 3 or 4 days. Some of these, people are familiar with it. They either experienced it or knew people that's happened to, hurricanes or otherwise. Yeah, let's make sure we have, everything charged up and, fueled up like we need, because, sometimes they can sort of put us out of commission for a few days. But also on the longer term, property level sort of considerations. And one thing I remind people too is if you're in an urban area in particular and there's been changes, construction or new land being developed nearby, that can actually impact, you may not have flooded in your basement, might not have flooded before that block was developed nearby. And suddenly the water drainage, the flow is altered quite a bit by this new development, or the winds even from large buildings that have gone up. It can channel the wind in much more focused fashion. You could get wind damage on your property and trees come down that you never expected before. So be aware of your surroundings, because that can affect the way the weather impacts your property in the future.
Last question then, and I ask this to a lot of people when we discuss disasters. What keeps you up at night when you think about the recent storms that we're seeing, and what makes you hopeful?
I think one of the big challenges, and I mentioned it earlier, was just the sources of information. People were bombarded by forecasts from different apps on our phone, from us, the Federal Weather Agency. Hopefully people are finding their way to our official government warning products and not being led too astray by maybe other false information or forecasts that are, off of the mark, outside of the official source. We continue to try to channel people toward the official government source.
Chris, thank you so much for this. This is really helpful for people.
Glad to do it.
That's Chris Fogarty, Program Manager at the Canadian Hurricane Centre. And that was The Big Story. For more from us, by now, we're at thebigstorypodcast.ca, and you can send us feedback on any topic you like, and especially ideas for topics we should cover. We love it when we get those. You can send them to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can call us up and leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find this podcast and all Frequency Podcast Network podcasts in your favorite podcast player or at frequencypodcastnetwork.com. And you can ask for The Big Story on your smart speaker by simply asking it to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.